The red light glowed above camera 2 when Johnny Carson did something he had never done in 28 years of television. He pulled his hand back. Silvester Stallone stood there, arm extended, waiting for the handshake that always came after the monologue. The studio audience watched 293 people holding their breath at once. Carson's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. The silence stretched 15 seconds. 20. Stallone's hand stayed out there, steady as granite, while America's most beloved host stared him down with something close to hatred. Then Stallone spoke 6 words that made every person in that studio forget they were watching television. What did Carson know about that Philadelphia street kid that nobody else did? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before that night, Johnny Carson sat in his Malibu office holding a worn Rolodex card between his fingers. Silvester Stallone's name was written in his secretary's neat handwriting, but someone had drawn a red line through it. Below that, in Carson's own careful script, never again, J.C. The card trembled slightly, not from age. Carson's hands were still steady at 56, but from something deeper, something that had been eating at him since Tuesday morning when the call came in. Carson had built his empire on consistency. Every weeknight for nearly 3 decades, America invited him into their living rooms. Parents put children to bed knowing Johnny would be there when they came back downstairs. Shift workers counted on his monologue to ease them into sleep. Insomniacs found comfort in his familiar voice cutting through the darkness. He was the last ritual of the American day. The Tonight Show operated like Swiss clockwork. Carson arrived at NBC Burbank every afternoon at exactly 4:15. He reviewed the guest list with his producers, practiced his monologue timing, and checked every detail twice. His desk was positioned precisely 18 inches from center stage. His coffee black, no sugar, waited in the same blue mug he had used since 1962. But Tuesday morning shattered that rhythm like a hammer through crystal. The call came at 7:43 a.m., just as Carson was reviewing his morning newspapers on the deck overlooking the Pacific. His unlisted phone line, the one only 5 people in the world knew, rang with an urgency that made his stomach clench. "Johnny." The voice was gravelly, older, careful. "We need to talk." Carson recognized Mickey Torino immediately, 40 years since they had spoken, but some voices carved themselves into memory. Mickey had been Carson's first booking agent back in Los Angeles, when Johnny was still grinding out comedy sets in strip mall clubs for $50 a night. Mickey knew everyone, heard everything, and never spoke without purpose. "What is it, Mickey?" "It's about the kid, Stallone." Carson felt something cold settle in his chest. "What about him?" "The story he tells, about the struggling actor days, about being broke and desperate, about writing Rocky in 3 days because he had no other choice." "Yeah? It's not true, Johnny, none of it." Carson walked to the edge of his deck, looking out at waves that suddenly seemed too loud. "Explain." "I've got photos, I've got witnesses, I've got bank records." Mickey's voice carried the weight of a man who had spent decades collecting secrets. That boy wasn't struggling, he was working. And the work he was doing... Mickey paused. "It hurt people, Johnny, good people." Carson closed his eyes. In the entertainment business, everyone had stories. Everyone had moments they would rather forget. But Carson had always believed in second chances, in the power of redemption. He had given countless actors their first real break. He had championed underdogs. He had celebrated comeback stories. Stallone had been one of his favorites. The first time Silvester appeared on The Tonight Show was in 1976, just before Rocky exploded into theaters. Carson remembered the young actor's nervous energy, his passion for the character he had created. Stallone spoke about writing the script longhand, about refusing to sell it unless he could star in it himself, about believing in dreams when nobody else would. The audience loved him. Carson loved him. America loved him. Stallone returned to the show 6 more times over the years. Each appearance was gold. He was funny without trying too hard, humble despite his success, and grateful in a way that felt genuine. He brought props, boxing gloves from the movie, photos from the set, stories about working with Burgess Meredith. Carson had introduced him to network executives. He had recommended him for roles. He had stood by him when critics called Rocky a fluke. Now Mickey was telling him it was all built on lies. "What do you want me to do with this?" Carson asked. "That's up to you," Mickey said, "but he's scheduled for your show Friday night, and I thought you should know what you're shaking hands with." After Mickey hung up, Carson sat in his office for 2 hours without moving. The Rolodex card felt heavier than it should have. He thought about trust, about the invisible contract between performer and audience. He thought about the people who watched his show specifically because they believed he only invited guests worth their time. By Thursday afternoon, Carson had made his decision. He called his head producer, Freddie de Cordova, into his office. Freddie had been with the show for 15 years, had seen Carson handle difficult guests, awkward moments, and behind-the-scenes drama with professional grace. "I need you to change something about Friday's show," Carson said. Freddie sat down, notepad ready. "What do you need?" "Stallone segment. Keep it short, very short. And I want to do the interview myself. No pre-interview questions, no coaching, no safety nets." Freddie frowned. Standard procedure required guest interviews to be mapped out in advance. Producers met with guests beforehand, discussed topics, identified good stories, and created a rough script for Carson to follow. It prevented awkward silences and guaranteed entertainment value. "Johnny, we always pre-interview. It's not this time. But what if he bombs? What if you run out of things to talk about?" Carson looked at the Rolodex card on his desk. "I won't." That evening, Carson drove to a small diner in Culver City, where Mickey was waiting in the back booth. The envelope Mickey handed him contained everything: photos that contradicted Stallone's timeline, financial records that showed money coming in when he claimed to be broke, witness statements from people who had been hurt. The most damning piece was a contract dated 6 months before Stallone claimed to have written Rocky. It showed him working for people who solved problems with violence, collecting debts from people who could not pay them, people who sometimes ended up in hospitals. "How long have you known?" Carson asked. "Since the beginning," Mickey said. "But back then, I figured everyone deserves a fresh start. Kid wanted to act. He could act. But when I see him on your show, telling those stories about struggling and dreaming and never giving up," Mickey shook his head. "Those stories belong to real people, people who actually lived them." Carson studied the contract. The signature was definitely Stallone's. He had signed enough autographs to recognize the handwriting. The dates were clear. The payment amounts were substantial. Who else knows? A few people. But they're not talking. They're scared, or they're paid, or they're both. Mickey lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm only telling you because you matter, Johnny. When you put someone on your show, people trust that. They think, if Johnny likes him, he must be okay. You're vouching for him." Carson folded the contract carefully. What happened to the people he collected from? Some paid up, some disappeared, some ended up in hospitals with broken bones and convenient amnesia. And nobody reported it? You report muscle to the police, you better be ready for what comes next. Most people just moved away and tried to forget. Carson drove home in silence, the envelope on the passenger seat like a loaded gun. He thought about the responsibility he carried, about the trust millions of viewers placed in him every night. He thought about Stallone sitting in makeup chairs, practicing his humble smile, preparing to tell more stories about his struggling actor days. He thought about the people who had actually lived those stories, who had actually struggled, who deserved to have their truth protected. By the time Carson reached Malibu, his decision was final. Friday night, America would learn who Silvester Stallone really was, not because Carson wanted to destroy him, but because some lies were too big to ignore. The Rolodex card went into his desk drawer. The red line through Stallone's name felt like a prophecy. In 36 hours, the most trusted man in America was going to break his own rule about keeping television friendly. The handshake that ended every interview was going to become the handshake that never was. Carson knew it would change everything, but some truths were worth the cost. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, unusual for Los Angeles in October. Carson woke at 5:30 a.m., an hour earlier than normal, and found himself staring at the ceiling while his wife Joanna slept beside him. The decision he had made felt heavier in the morning light. At 6:15, his private phone rang again. Carson answered on the first ring, expecting Mickey's gravelly voice. Instead, he heard something that made his blood freeze. "Mr. Carson?" The voice was young, female, nervous. "My name is Maria Santos. Mickey Torino gave me your number." Carson sat up in bed, careful not to wake Joanna. "What can I do for you, Maria? Mickey said you might want to hear my story. About Silvester Stallone." Carson walked to his study, closing the door behind him. Through the windows, the Pacific stretched endlessly under a pewter sky. "I'm listening." It was 1975. I was 19, working at my father's grocery store in Philadelphia. We were behind on payments to some people. Bad people. Her voice caught. Stallone came to collect. Carson gripped the phone tighter. "Go on." He wasn't famous then. Just another guy doing dirty work for money. But he was different from the others. Smarter. More careful. Maria paused. He never threatened directly, never raised his voice. But he had this way of looking at you that made your skin crawl. "What happened?" "My father couldn't pay. We had maybe $300 in the register, but we owed $2,000. Stallone said that was fine. He said he understood family businesses." Her voice dropped to a whisper. Then he picked up a can of tomatoes and threw it through our front window. Carson felt his stomach tighten. He said accidents happen in family businesses. Said maybe next time it wouldn't be a window. Maybe it would be something more important. Someone more important. Maria's breathing became shaky. "He was talking about my little brother. Tommy was only 8. "Did you report it? To who?" "The police were paid to look the other way. The neighborhood knew better than to talk. And Stallone was smart about it. Nothing he said was technically a threat. Just suggestions, just observations about how dangerous the world could be." Carson stared out at the ocean. "How did you resolve it?" "My father sold everything. The store, our car, my mother's jewelry. We scraped together the money and paid. Then we moved to California and changed our name." Maria's voice hardened. 20 years later, I'm watching The Tonight Show with my kids, and there's the man who destroyed my family, talking about his dreams and struggles, talking about writing Rocky because he knew what it was like to be poor. Why are you telling me this now? Because Mickey said you're the only one who might actually do something about it. He said you care about the truth. She paused. And because I saw the commercial yesterday. Stallone's going to be on your show tonight. Carson felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Maria, if I do something with this information, are you prepared for what might happen? Stallone's not the same man he was in 1975. He has money now, lawyers, influence. I'm not afraid of him anymore, Mr. Carson. But those stories he tells about struggling and dreaming, they're stolen. They belong to people like my father, who actually lived them. People who actually suffered. After Maria hung up, Carson sat in his study for an hour, watching the sun burn through the marine layer. He thought about the millions of people who would tune in that night, expecting their usual dose of harmless entertainment. He thought about his own reputation, built on decades of professionalism and restraint. Then he thought about Maria's 8-year-old brother, and his decision crystallized into something unbreakable. At 9 a.m., Carson's assistant Dorothy knocked on his study door. "Johnny, there's a package for you, no return address." The messenger said it was urgent. Carson opened the manila envelope with steady hands. Inside was a partially burned telegram, the Western Union header still visible at the top. Most of the text was illegible, charred beyond recognition, but 3 words stood out clearly in the middle of the page: Stallone knows, and below that Friday night. The signature at the bottom was burned away, leaving only a smudged initial that could have been anything. Carson turned the telegram over, looking for more clues, but found only ash stains and the acrid smell of old smoke. Someone had tried to destroy this message, but not completely. Someone wanted him to see it. His hands shook slightly as he set the telegram on his desk. The implications were clear. Stallone knew that Carson knew. This was no longer about surprising a guest with uncomfortable questions. This was about 2 men who understood exactly what was at stake. Carson called his head of security, a former FBI agent named Tom Bradley, who handled threats and difficult situations with quiet efficiency. "Tom, I need you to do something for me tonight." "What do you need, Johnny?" "Extra security for the show, but keep it invisible. I don't want the audience to notice anything unusual." "What kind of threat are we talking about?" Carson looked at the burned telegram. "I'm not sure yet, but someone wanted me to know that tonight might not go according to plan. Should we cancel the Stallone segment?" "No." Carson's voice was firm. "But I want you in the booth, and I want our conversation tonight to be recorded on a separate system, one that doesn't go through the normal network channels." "Johnny, what's going on?" I'm about to do something I've never done in 30 years of television, Tom, and apparently other people know about it. At noon, Carson received another call. This time, it was Freddie de Cordova, his producer, and the panic in Freddie's voice was unmistakable. "Johnny, we have a problem. Stallone's people just called. They want to review the interview questions in advance. They're insisting on it." "What did you tell them?" "I told them what you told me. No pre-interview, no prepared questions. They're not happy about it." Carson smiled grimly. "I bet they're not. They're threatening to pull out of the show. They say Stallone has other commitments he could attend to instead. Let them pull out. Johnny, he's our biggest draw tonight. The audience is expecting him. The network is expecting the ratings." Carson looked at the telegram on his desk, then at Maria's phone number written on a slip of paper beside it. "Freddie, sometimes ratings aren't the most important thing. I don't understand." "You will. Tonight." By 2 p.m., the word had spread through the NBC building. Johnny Carson was planning something unusual for the Friday show. Nobody knew exactly what, but the tension was palpable. Crew members who had worked with Carson for years noticed the change in his demeanor. He was calmer than usual, but with an edge they had never seen before. At 3 p.m., Stallone's representative called one final time. "Mr. Carson will answer questions about Rocky, about his upcoming projects, and about his family," the voice said. "Nothing about his past before acting, nothing about Philadelphia, nothing personal." Carson took the call himself. "Tell Mr. Stallone that I'll ask whatever questions seem appropriate for my audience. Mr. Carson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Stallone is doing you a favor by appearing on your show. He has standards about how he's treated." Carson's voice remained perfectly calm. "As do I." The line went dead. At 4:15 p.m., Carson arrived at NBC Burbank for what he knew would be the most important show of his career. In his jacket pocket, he carried Maria's phone number and the burned telegram. In his heart, he carried the weight of truth that could no longer be ignored. America's most trusted man was about to break the most sacred rule of late-night television: never embarrass your guests. But some rules, Carson had decided, were made to be broken. NBC Burbank at 4:15 p.m. felt different that Friday afternoon. Carson walked through the familiar hallways with the measured pace of a man approaching his own execution. Stagehands who normally called out greetings kept their voices low. Producers huddled in corners, whispering about the unusual tension crackling through the building. Carson's dressing room had been his sanctuary for 15 years. Same mirror, same chair, same ritual, but today even that felt foreign. He hung his jacket carefully on the back of his chair, then pulled out the NBC rehearsal schedule that Dorothy had prepared. The Stallone segment was listed simply: Silvester Stallone, 8 minutes, general interview. But someone had added handwritten notes in Carson's careful script along the margins. "Keep it short. No personal questions." The irony wasn't lost on him. He had written those instructions to protect his staff from whatever was coming, not to protect Stallone. At 4:45, makeup artist Helen Turley knocked and entered. She had been painting Carson's face for television since 1967, had seen him through divorces, career changes, and countless difficult nights. But she paused when she saw his expression. "You okay, Johnny?" Carson settled into the makeup chair, studying his reflection. At 56, he looked older than his years today. The burden of what he was planning had carved new lines around his eyes. "Helen, have you ever had to choose between being professional and being honest?" She began applying foundation with practiced strokes. "Every day, honey. Every day. What do you do?" "Depends on who gets hurt worse by the choice." Carson nodded slowly. "Tonight might get uncomfortable." Helen's hands paused for just a moment. "How uncomfortable?" "I'm not sure yet." At 5:30, Freddie de Cordova burst into the dressing room without knocking. His usual composed demeanor cracked like broken glass. "Johnny, we've got a situation." Carson looked up from the guest list he was reviewing. "What now?" "Stallone's here, early. He brought his own security team and a lawyer." "A lawyer?" "Says it's standard procedure for all his television appearances now. But Johnny—" Freddie lowered his voice. "I've been doing this for 20 years. Guests don't bring lawyers unless they're expecting trouble." Carson felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. "Where is he now?" "Green room 2, with his people. They've been in there for 15 minutes with the door closed. Any word on what they're discussing? Freddie shook his head. But our sound guy was walking past and heard raised voices. Someone was upset about something. At 6 p.m., Carson made his way to the rehearsal stage for his usual run-through. The crew was setting up for the night's taping, but their movement seemed more careful than usual, as if everyone sensed that tonight was different. Director Bobby Quinn approached with the evening's shot list. "Johnny, about the Stallone segment, you want the usual setup? 2-shot for the interview, close-ups for the funny bits?" Carson studied the stage layout. "Keep the cameras wide. I want the audience visible in every shot. Any particular reason? I want people to see how real this is." At 6:30, Carson was reviewing his monologue notes when his assistant knocked. "Johnny, there's someone here to see you. Says it's personal." Carson looked up to see Maria Santos standing in his doorway. She was smaller than he had imagined, maybe 5 feet tall, with graying hair and hands that showed decades of hard work. But her eyes held a strength that reminded him why he had made his decision. "Mrs. Santos, I didn't expect to see you here. I drove down from Bakersfield. I needed to tell you something in person." She stepped into the dressing room, glancing around at the controlled chaos of pre-show preparation. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I realize I didn't tell you the most important part." Carson gestured for her to sit. "I'm listening. When Stallone came to our store that day in 1975, my father tried to reason with him, tried to explain that we were good people, that we would pay as soon as we could." Maria's voice grew quiet. Stallone listened to the whole thing, nodded like he understood. Then he said something I'll never forget. What did he say? He said, "I understand completely, Mr. Santos. Family is everything, which is why I hope nothing happens to yours." Maria looked directly at Carson. Then he looked at my little brother Tommy and smiled. Carson felt his stomach clench. What happened to Tommy? He never got over it. The fear, I mean. He had nightmares for years. Wouldn't walk to school alone. Wouldn't play outside after dark. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "When we moved to California, Tommy started getting better. But every time he sees Stallone on television, talking about dreams and second chances, Tommy leaves the room." Carson reached across and squeezed her hand. "Mrs. Santos, you know that what I'm planning tonight might not change anything, right? It might just make things worse for you. Mr. Carson, I'm 59 years old. I've spent 40 years being afraid of what that man might do if people learned the truth about him. But you know what I realized today?" She smiled for the first time since entering the room. "I'm tired of being afraid." At 7 p.m., Carson stood in the wings watching the audience file into the studio. 300 people, most of whom had waited months for tickets to The Tonight Show. They came expecting entertainment, escape, the comfortable ritual of America's favorite late-night host. They had no idea they were about to witness television history. Stage manager Carl was running through the evening's schedule when he noticed Carson's unusual stillness. "You ready for tonight, Johnny? Carl, in all the years you've worked with me, have I ever done anything that surprised you?" Carl laughed. "Johnny, you surprise me every night. That's why this show works. Tonight might be different." "Different how?" Carson watched a family in the front row, parents with 2 teenage kids, all of them excited to be there. "Tonight, I'm going to ask the audience to trust me more than they ever have before." At 7:30, word came back from the green room that Stallone was asking specific questions about the interview format. He wanted to know if there would be clips from his movies. He wanted to know if other guests would be on stage with him. He wanted to know how long his segment would run. Carson sent back a simple message: "Tell Mr. Stallone that everything will be explained during the show." At 7:45, Carson received his final surprise of the evening. Tom Bradley, his security chief, appeared at his dressing room door holding a small tape recorder. "Johnny, I need to show you something." Bradley pressed play. Carson heard his own voice from earlier that day, talking to Freddie about keeping the Stallone segment short. Then he heard another voice, clearer than it should have been. "Someone's been recording your conversations," Bradley said quietly. Carson's blood ran cold. "How? Professional equipment? Someone who knew what they were doing?" Bradley paused the tape. "This recording was made in your private office this afternoon." Carson stared at the machine. Who would have access? Could be anyone with the right equipment and motivation, but Johnny... Bradley met his eyes. Whoever did this wanted you to know about it. This tape was left on my desk with a note that said, "For Mr. Carson's protection." Carson sat down heavily. The game was more complex than he had realized. Someone was watching, recording, documenting everything. But were they trying to protect him or trap him? "Tom, I want you to record tonight's show from 3 different angles, audio and video. If something happens to the official broadcast, I want backup copies that can't be touched." "Johnny, what exactly are you planning?" Carson looked at his reflection in the dressing room mirror. In 15 minutes, he would walk out onto that stage and either restore his faith in the power of truth or destroy the reputation he had spent 30 years building. "I'm planning to find out what happens when the most trusted man in America stops being polite." At 7:58 p.m., Carson stood behind the curtain, listening to Doc Severinsen's orchestra play the familiar opening theme. 2 minutes until showtime. 2 minutes until he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In his jacket pocket, he carried Maria's phone number and the burned telegram. In his heart, he carried the weight of every viewer who trusted him to bring only worthy guests into their homes. Stallone was somewhere behind him in the green room, probably running through his familiar stories about struggle and perseverance in the American dream. But tonight, America was going to learn that some dreams were built on other people's nightmares. The red light flashed. Carson stepped through the curtain into his kingdom, knowing it might be the last time he ever felt completely in control of what happened next. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson began exactly as it had 4,000 times before. Carson walked through the rainbow curtain, arms raised to acknowledge the applause, his smile practiced and warm. The studio audience rose to their feet, 300 people who had no idea they were about to witness the most uncomfortable moment in late-night television history. Thank you very much," Carson said, settling behind his desk as the applause died down. "Welcome to the Tonight Show. We've got a great show tonight." For 18 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Carson delivered his monologue with the timing that had made him America's favorite comedian. He joked about politicians, about California weather, about the absurdities of daily life. The audience laughed in all the right places. Doc Severinsen's band provided perfect musical punctuation. But in the audio booth, sound engineer Mike Patterson noticed something unusual. Carson had requested that all microphones stay hot during commercial breaks, something that had never happened in Mike's 12 years with the show. The audio recording sheet in front of him carried a handwritten note from Carson. "Record everything. No gaps." Mike had worked enough live television to know when something was off. Tonight felt like waiting for a thunderstorm. The first guest was Bernadette Peters, promoting her new Broadway show. Carson was charming, professional, perfectly in control. But Mike noticed that Carson kept glancing toward the green room entrance, checking the clock on his desk more frequently than usual. During the commercial break after Peters, Carson called Mike over. "Everything running smoothly up there?" "Perfect, Johnny. All levels good." Mike hesitated. "You okay? You seem different tonight." Carson adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture his crew rarely saw. "Mike, I need you to do something for me. If anything unusual happens during the next segment, keep recording. No matter what anyone tells you." "What do you mean, unusual?" "I mean anything. Arguments, people walking off stage, dead air. Just keep the machines running." At 11:42 p.m., Ed McMahon stepped to the microphone for the introduction everyone had been waiting for. Johnny's next guest is the Academy Award-nominated actor and writer who created one of cinema's most beloved characters, Rocky Balboa. Please welcome Silvester Stallone. The audience erupted. Stallone emerged from behind the curtain looking exactly like America expected, confident, grateful, humble despite his success. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, his hair styled with casual precision. He waved to the crowd with both hands, blew a kiss to someone in the front row, and walked toward Carson's desk with the easy swagger that had made him a star. Carson stood to greet him, just as he had done thousands of times before with thousands of other guests. The handshake was a ritual, a symbol of welcome and mutual respect that viewers had come to expect. But when Stallone extended his hand, Carson hesitated. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, Carson stared at the offered hand like it was a loaded weapon. The studio audience didn't notice. They were still applauding, still caught up in the excitement of seeing their favorite actor. But Stallone noticed. His smile flickered, just slightly, and his eyes searched Carson's face for an explanation that wasn't coming. Carson pulled his hand back. The applause continued for another few seconds before people began to realize something was wrong. The silence spread like ripples in a pond, starting with the front rows and moving backward until even the balcony was quiet. Stallone's hand hung in the air between them, steady as granite despite the humiliation. He had been dismissed in front of 300 people and millions more watching at home, but his expression never changed. If anything, his smile grew wider, more confident. "Tough crowd tonight, Johnny?" Stallone said, his voice carrying just enough humor to make it seem like a joke. Carson didn't laugh. "Please, sit down." The tension was thick enough to cut. Carson settled behind his desk while Stallone took the guest chair, both men maintaining the appearance of normalcy while everyone in the studio sensed that something fundamental had shifted. "So," Carson began, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "Rocky. Yeah, Rocky." Stallone leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed despite what had just happened. "Still can't believe how that story connected with people. Tell us about writing it." It was the same question Carson had asked him 6 times over the years, and Stallone launched into the familiar story with practiced ease. The struggling actor, the inspiration from watching Muhammad Ali fight, writing the script in 3.5 days, refusing to sell it unless he could star in it himself. "I had $37 in my bank account," Stallone said, and the audience chuckled appreciatively. "Had to sell my dog just to pay rent." Carson watched him tell the story, noting every gesture, every pause, every moment designed to generate sympathy. In the audio booth, Mike Patterson saw Carson's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. $37, Carson repeated slowly. "That's right, I was nobody. Just another wannabe actor in New York, getting rejected at auditions, sleeping on friends' couches." Stallone's voice carried the perfect note of humble reflection. "But I believed in the story, you know? I believed that everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves." Carson nodded thoughtfully. "And this was when? 1975? Yeah, about then. Those were tough times, Johnny. Really tough times. What were you doing for money? You know, before the acting career took off?" For the first time since sitting down, Stallone paused. It was barely noticeable, maybe half a second, but Carson caught it. "Oh, you know, the usual stuff. Waiting tables, construction work, whatever I could find." Stallone's smile never wavered. Anything to keep the dream alive. "Construction work. Yeah, here and there. Mostly small jobs, cash under the table, that kind of thing." Carson leaned forward slightly. "In Philadelphia?" Another pause, longer this time. In the audience, people began to sense that this wasn't going the way these interviews usually went. There was an edge to Carson's voice, a prosecutorial quality that made everyone uncomfortable. "Some in Philadelphia, yeah. Some in New York. I went wherever the work was." "And you never had any other sources of income during that period?" Stallone's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I don't understand what you mean." Carson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He didn't open it, just held it in his hands like evidence. "I mean, it's unusual for someone who's completely broke to turn down steady work, especially work that pays well. I never turned down honest work, Johnny." The word honest hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Carson let it sit there for a moment, let the audience absorb the implication. "Of course," Carson said finally. "Honest work." In the green room, Stallone's lawyer was standing now, watching the monitor with growing alarm. He had handled dozens of entertainment industry crises, but he had never seen anything like this. Carson wasn't attacking directly, wasn't making accusations. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was asking questions that had no good answers. Back on stage, Stallone was working harder now to maintain his composure. The easy confidence was still there, but it required effort. "Johnny, I'm not sure where you're going with this. I'm just curious about that period in your life. Before fame, before success, before people knew your name." Carson's voice remained perfectly calm, perfectly professional. "It's such an inspiring story, the struggling artist who refuses to give up on his dreams. It's true, Johnny. Every word of it." Carson nodded slowly. "I'm sure it is." The silence stretched between them again. In the audio booth, Mike Patterson watched the VU meters dancing as they captured every breath, every pause, every unspoken accusation. "You know," Carson continued, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've interviewed thousands of people. Actors, politicians, writers, athletes. And you know what I've learned? Stallone waited. Everyone has a story, but the best stories are the true ones. Mine is true, Johnny. I'm sure the parts you've told us are true, but sometimes the most interesting parts are the ones people don't talk about. Carson finally unfolded the paper in his hands, the parts that happened between the lines. Stallone's eyes fixed on the document. He couldn't read it from where he sat, but something in Carson's tone suggested it contained information he'd rather keep private. Johnny, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Oh, I don't think there's any misunderstanding. Carson looked directly at Stallone, his blue eyes steady as winter sky. I think some people just prefer certain versions of their story to others. The studio audience was completely silent now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something else entirely, something they weren't prepared for. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In homes across America, viewers were reaching for their phone to call friends, to make sure they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. Johnny Carson, the most polite man on television, was slowly, methodically, dismantling his guest on live TV, and they still had 4 minutes left in the segment. Carson held the document steady in his hands, letting the silence build until it became unbearable. In the audio booth, Mike Patterson watched the VU meters register nothing but the hum of air conditioning and the barely audible breathing of 300 people holding their breath. "Silvester," Carson said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a verdict, "I have in my hands a contract dated February 15, 1975, 6 months before you claim to have written Rocky." Stallone's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about, Johnny. It's a work contract. Payment for services rendered." Carson looked directly into the camera, speaking to America. "Services that involved collecting money from people who couldn't pay their debts." The studio audience gasped. Not the polite intake of breath that followed a comedian's punchline, but the sharp, collective sound of people realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. Stallone started to stand. "Johnny, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Sit down." The command was quiet but absolute. Carson had never spoken to a guest that way in 30 years of television. Stallone hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered himself back into the chair. "The contract shows payment of $1,500 for what's described as debt recovery services in the Philadelphia area." Carson's voice remained conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "That's a lot of money for someone who supposedly only had $37 in his bank account." "Johnny, I'm not finished." The phrase hit the studio like a thunderclap. Carson never interrupted guests. Never. His entire reputation was built on politeness, on making his guests feel comfortable and welcome. "The contract is signed by Salvatore Torino and Associates, people in the debt collection business, people who solved problems for other people who didn't like to get their hands dirty." Carson paused. "Your signature is right there at the bottom, Silvester, clear as day." In the green room, Stallone's lawyer was pacing now, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking rapidly to someone, probably network executives, probably demanding that the show cut to commercial immediately. But Carson wasn't stopping. "I also have a sworn statement from Maria Santos. Her family owned a grocery store in Philadelphia in 1975. They fell behind on some payments to some very bad people." Carson looked directly at Stallone. "You were sent to collect." Stallone's composure finally cracked. The easy confidence vanished, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. For just a moment, the audience saw the man Maria Santos had described, the one who could break a window with a can of tomatoes and smile while he did it. "That's enough, Carson. Her father was an immigrant, worked 18 hours a day trying to keep his business alive, trying to feed his family. He couldn't pay $2,000 he owed, so your employers sent you to convince him." Carson's voice grew colder. "You threw a can of tomatoes through his front window. Then you looked at his 8-year-old son and made sure everyone understood what might happen next if the money didn't appear. You don't know what you're talking about. The Santos family lost everything. Had to sell their store, their car, everything they owned to pay the debt. Then they moved to California, and change their name because they were afraid you might come back. Stallone stood up again, and this time Carson didn't stop him. This is bullshit, Johnny. Complete bullshit. The profanity on live television sent another shock through the studio. Carson sat perfectly still, letting Stallone's anger hang in the air for everyone to see. Maria Santos is 40 years old now, Carson continued quietly. She drove down from Bakersfield today to tell me her story, to tell me what really happened before you became America's favorite underdog. She's lying, is she? Because I also have bank records showing regular deposits into your account during the exact period when you claim you were sleeping on friends' couches and selling your dog for food. Carson opened another piece of paper. 1,500 here, 2,000 there, 1,200 the next week. For someone who was supposedly broke, you were making pretty good money. Stallone looked toward the wings, toward his lawyer, toward anyone who might stop this nightmare. But Carson owned this stage, had owned it for 15 years, and no one was going to save him. The inspiring story about writing Rocky in 3 days, the struggling actor who refused to give up on his dreams. Carson's voice carried a note of genuine sadness now. That story belongs to other people, Silvester. People who actually lived it. People who actually struggled while you were breaking windows and threatening children. You son of a bitch. The words came out like bullets, sharp and angry and desperate. Stallone took a step toward Carson's desk, his hands clenched into fists. Carson didn't flinch. Is that what you said to Maria Santos's father? Is that what you said to all the other families you terrorized before you decided acting might be easier work? I never hurt anybody. You terrorized a family. You threatened a child. You destroyed a man's business because he couldn't pay money to criminals. Carson's composure finally cracked, just slightly. And then you built a career telling everyone how hard your life was. Stallone stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his carefully constructed image crumbling around him like a house of cards. The studio audience watched in frozen silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Then Stallone laughed. It wasn't the warm, infectious laugh that had charmed audiences for years. It was cold and sharp and completely without humor. You want the truth, Johnny? You really want the fucking truth? Carson waited. Yeah, I collected debts. Yeah, I broke some windows and scared some people. So what? Stallone's voice carried a note of defiance now, almost pride. You think those people didn't know what they were getting into when they borrowed money from criminals? You think they thought it was a charity? The audience recoiled as if they'd been slapped. This wasn't the Silvester, Stallone they knew. This was someone else entirely, someone cold and calculating and utterly without remorse. And you know what else? I was good at it. Really good. Because I understood something that you don't understand sitting up there in your ivory tower. Stallone gestured around the studio. Sometimes people need to be scared. Sometimes fear is the only thing that works. Carson stared at him, seeing finally the man behind the mask. Is that what you told yourself when you looked at an 8-year-old boy and threatened his life? I never threatened anybody's life. You didn't have to. That's what made you so effective, isn't it? You let people's imagination do the work. Stallone's smile returned, but it was different now, sharper, more honest. That's right, Johnny. Fear is much more powerful than violence, and fear is what built everything I have today. The studio was dead silent. In homes across America, people were staring at their television screens in shock, watching a man they had admired reveal himself to be something monstrous. Carson had gotten his confession, but in getting it, he had unleashed something that couldn't be put back in the box. The confession hung in the air like poison gas. 300 people in the studio audience sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just heard. America's favorite underdog had just admitted to terrorizing families and threatening children, and he had done it with a smile. Carson reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of handwritten index cards. These weren't his usual cue cards with harmless questions about upcoming movies and family life. These were the questions he had written the night before, the ones that would strip away whatever remained of Stallone's carefully constructed image. Let's talk about the Santos family, Carson said, his voice steady as granite. Stallone was still standing, his hands clenched at his sides, caught between the desire to walk off stage and the knowledge that doing so would only make everything worse. I told you, I never hurt anybody. You destroyed their lives." Carson looked down at his notes. Maria Santos was 19 when we came to their store. Her father, Eduardo, had borrowed money to keep the business afloat during a bad month. He thought he was dealing with legitimate creditors. "Legitimate?" Stallone laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Johnny, there's no such thing as legitimate in that business. Everyone knows the rules. An 8-year-old boy knows the rules. Kids learn fast in neighborhoods like that." Carson set down his cards and looked directly at Stallone. "Tommy Santos had nightmares for 3 years after you threatened him. His family had to move to California and change their name because they were afraid you might come back. That's their problem." The coldness in Stallone's voice sent a chill through the studio. This wasn't the man who had played Rocky Balboa, the underdog with a heart of gold. This was someone else entirely, someone who viewed human suffering as a business expense. "Tommy is 38 now," Carson continued. "He runs a small auto repair shop in Bakersfield, still jumps when he hears unexpected noises, still has trouble sleeping." Carson's voice grew harder. "His sister Maria says he can't watch your movies because seeing your face brings back the nightmares." "Ancient history, Johnny. Is it? Because I have something else here." Carson pulled out another document, a letter from Dr. Sarah Chen at UCLA Medical Center. She's been treating Tommy Santos for post-traumatic stress disorder for 15 years. Stallone's confident mask slipped again. "You can't prove any of that is connected to me." "Can't I?" Carson unfolded the letter. Dr. Chen writes that Tommy's trauma stems from a specific incident in childhood when a man threatened his family's safety. Tommy described the man as having dark hair, an intense stare, and a way of speaking that made violence seem inevitable without ever stating it directly. The studio was dead silent except for the hum of television equipment. In the audio booth, Mike Patterson watched his VU meters registering the conversation that would end careers and destroy reputations. Tommy also remembered something else, Carson continued. The man had a slight scar above his left eyebrow. From a boxing injury, he claimed. Stallone's hand moved unconsciously to the scar above his left eye. The one he had always said came from sparring sessions while preparing for Rocky. The gesture lasted only a second, but Carson caught it. So did the cameras. "Funny how some scars tell the real story," Carson said quietly. In the green room, Stallone's legal team was in full crisis mode. His lawyer was on the phone with network executives, demanding they cut the broadcast immediately. His publicist was calculating damage control strategies. His manager was already mentally drafting resignation letters. But Carson wasn't finished. "I want to read you something, Silvester." Carson picked up a different piece of paper, this one handwritten in careful script. "This is from Tommy Santos himself. He wrote it this afternoon after his sister called to tell him what was happening tonight." Stallone took a step back toward his chair, but didn't sit down. He writes, "For 30 years, I've watched you on television telling people about dreams and never giving up. Every time I remember that day in my father's store when you taught me that some people's dreams are built on other people's nightmares." Carson looked up from the letter. "You taught me that fear is a weapon, and that weapon works best against children and families who have no way to fight back. You taught me that bullies become heroes if they're good enough at pretending to be something else." "That's enough," Stallone said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I want people to know that Rocky Balboa is a lie. The real Silvester Stallone is the man who threw a can of tomatoes through our window and smiled when my mother started crying. The real Silvester Stallone is the man who looked at an 8-year-old boy and made him understand what it felt like to be helpless." Carson folded the letter carefully. Tommy ends by saying he hopes tonight will help other people understand the difference between real struggle and manufactured inspiration. Stallone stood there for a moment, his jaw working soundlessly. The easy confidence was completely gone now, replaced by something desperate and cornered. "You think you're some kind of hero, Johnny? You think destroying me makes you righteous? I think the truth makes itself righteous," Carson replied. "I'm just the messenger. You're a sanctimonious bastard who's never had to fight for anything in his life." Carson's composure cracked slightly. "I've fought plenty, Silvester. But I never fought against families trying to feed their children. I never terrorized people weaker than me and called it work. You don't know anything about that world." "You're right, I don't. And neither did the Santos family until you brought that world to their door. Stallone looked around the studio, seeing 300 faces staring at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. These people had come expecting entertainment, expecting to see their favorite actor charm their favorite host. Instead, they were watching the public execution of a man they had once loved. So what now, Johnny? You've had your big moment. You've destroyed my reputation, probably ended my career. What's the endgame here? Carson looked at him for a long moment, then at the cameras broadcasting this moment to millions of homes across America. The endgame is that people know who you really are, and they can decide for themselves what that's worth. The commercial break was 30 seconds away. 30 seconds until the most explosive moment in television history would pause, giving everyone time to process what they had witnessed. But Carson had one more card to play. "Before we break," he said, reaching for his final note card, "I want to ask you about the 6 words you're famous for tonight." The studio held its breath as Carson held up his final note card. 20 seconds until commercial break. 20 seconds until the most explosive moment in television history would reach its peak. "The 6 words," Carson said slowly, "that you spoke when I refused to shake your hand tonight." Stallone's eyes narrowed. "What about them? Would you like to repeat them for our audience, in case anyone missed them?" Stallone glanced toward the wings where his lawyer was frantically gesturing for him to walk off stage. Then he looked back at Carson, and something shifted in his expression. The desperation faded, replaced by a cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than his anger. "You really want to hear them again, Johnny? I think America deserves to hear them." Stallone smiled, and it was the most chilling expression anyone in that studio had ever seen. "I said, some things never change, Johnny." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. The audience looked confused. These weren't the shocking, explosive words they had been expecting. They sounded almost ordinary, but Carson's face went white. "Some things never change," Carson repeated slowly. "That's right." Stallone's smile widened. "You look surprised, Johnny, like you didn't expect me to remember." Carson gripped his note card so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Remember what? Oh, come on. Don't tell me you've forgotten. Nebraska, 1962. The Riverside Club. You were still doing comedy sets for $50 a night." The studio audience sensed a shift in the dynamic, but they couldn't understand what was happening. Carson, who had been in complete control moments before, suddenly looked like a man who had walked into a trap. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do." Stallone took a step closer to Carson's desk. "You remember Mickey Torino, right? Your old booking agent? The one who gave you this information about me?" Carson said nothing. "Mickey's been carrying around a lot of secrets for a lot of years, Johnny, including some about you." Stallone's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried throughout the studio. "Should I tell everyone what really happened that night in Nebraska? There's nothing to tell, isn't there? Because I have a friend who was there, someone who saw everything." Stallone reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. "Want to see?" Carson stared at the photo from across the desk, unable to see the details but knowing exactly what it showed. His face revealed everything the audience needed to know. "You see, Johnny, Mickey wasn't just my source tonight. He was your source too, 30 years ago, when you needed help with a problem that could have ended your career before it started." The commercial break countdown hit 10 seconds, but nobody in the control room was thinking about advertising anymore. "There was a girl in Nebraska," Stallone continued quietly. 16 years old. She came to your show that night, backstage afterward, starstruck, trusting. His voice hardened. "And you took advantage of that trust. That's not what happened." "No? Then what did happen, Johnny?" "Because my friend with the camera was very interested in documenting everything. 5 seconds to commercial. You're lying. Am I?" "Because Mickey kept that photograph for 30 years. Insurance, he called it. And when you called him this week asking for dirt on me, he realized it was time to cash in that insurance policy." 3 seconds. "The girl's name was Susan Walsh," Stallone said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She was 16, Johnny. 16, 2 seconds. Some things never change." 1 second. The red light went off, commercial break, but nobody moved. The studio audience sat frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. Carson remained behind his desk, his face ashen, while Stallone stood triumphant beside him. In the control room, chaos erupted. Producers were screaming into phones trying to figure out what to do next. Network executives who had been watching from their offices were already in cars heading to the studio. On stage, Carson and Stallone stared at each other across a divide that had nothing to do with the physical space between them. "That photograph," Carson said quietly, "shows nothing illegal, doesn't it? Because Susan Walsh says differently, says you gave her alcohol, says you convinced her she was special, says you took advantage of a child's hero worship." Stallone leaned closer. "Sound familiar, Johnny? Taking something pure and innocent and twisting it for your own benefit?" Carson's hands were shaking now. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. The difference between us, Johnny, is that I never pretended to be America's moral conscience." Stallone straightened his tie. "You built your entire career on being trustworthy, clean, the kind of man parents could trust with their children. The commercial break was halfway over. In 90 seconds, they would be back on live television, and everyone involved knew that whatever happened next would destroy careers and end lives. "Mickey set this up," Carson said. "Mickey's been planning this for 30 years, waiting for the right moment, waiting for you to get self-righteous enough to attack someone else." Stallone smiled. "Congratulations, Johnny, you played right into his hands." Carson looked out at the audience, these people who had trusted him, who had invited him into their homes every night for 15 years. He thought about the millions, watching at home, probably calling friends and family right now to make sure they were witnessing television history. "What do you want?" Carson asked. "I want you to finish this interview like a professional. I want you to shake my hand when it's over, and I want you to remember that some secrets are bigger than others." The floor director was counting down from 10. "And Johnny," Stallone added quietly, "if this footage ever airs, if any of this conversation ever gets out, Susan Walsh is going to get a phone call. And she's going to remember a lot more than she's told anyone so far. 5, 4, 3. Carson looked at the camera, knowing that in 2 seconds he would have to face America and pretend that everything was normal. 2, 1, the red light came on. "We're back," Carson said, his voice somehow steady despite everything that had just happened, talking with Silvester Stallone. But now everyone in that studio knew who was really in control. 3 days after the most explosive night in television history, Johnny Carson sat in his Malibu office staring at a handwritten journal entry dated Saturday morning. 4 lines in his careful script: "Did what I had to do. Some truths are worth the cost. Johnny will survive. Not sure about the friendship." But now, reading those words in the cold light of aftermath, Carson understood how naive he had been. The show had ended quietly. After the commercial break, Carson and Stallone had finished their interview with professional courtesy, discussing Rocky's upcoming sequel and Stallone's future projects. To viewers who hadn't witnessed the earlier confrontation, the final 5 minutes seemed perfectly normal. But everyone in that studio knew they had watched 2 men destroy each other on live television. The handshake came at the end, just as it always did. Carson extended his hand, and Stallone took it with a smile that looked genuine to the cameras, but felt like ice to Carson. They held the grip for exactly 3 seconds while America watched, neither man's expression revealing that they had just participated in mutual career assassination. NBC executives had made their decision by Sunday afternoon. The footage of Carson's accusations against Stallone would never air. The network claimed technical difficulties had corrupted the recording, a convenient lie that protected everyone involved. The official version of that Friday night show would only include the final 5 minutes, the polite conversation about movies and the friendly handshake that ended it. But the studio audience remembered everything. Within hours, bootleg audio recordings were circulating through Hollywood. By Monday, entertainment reporters were chasing down witnesses, trying to piece together what had really happened on The Tonight Show stage. Stallone's career survived, as Carson had known it would. The man who had terrorized families and threatened children was too valuable to the movie industry to sacrifice over ancient history. His publicists released statements about the unreliability of decade-old accusations. His lawyers sent cease and desist letters to anyone trying to spread the story. Rocky III premiered 6 months later to huge box office numbers. Carson's reputation, however, was more fragile. The rumors about Nebraska in 1962 spread like poison through the entertainment industry. Susan Walsh was never contacted by reporters. Stallone had made sure of that, but the whispers were enough. The man who had built his empire on trust and moral authority found that authority undermined by questions he couldn't answer without admitting to truths he preferred to keep buried. Mickey Torino disappeared 3 days after the show aired, leaving behind an empty apartment and a forwarding address that led nowhere. His final message to Carson came through a mutual friend. "Some games have no winners, Johnny. Just different kinds of losers." Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show for another 12 years, but something fundamental had changed that Friday night. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a wariness that his longtime viewers sensed but couldn't explain. He became more careful with his guests, more guarded in his interactions, more aware that everyone in Hollywood carried secrets that could be weaponized if the stakes got high enough. Maria Santos never spoke publicly about her family's ordeal, but she watched the news coverage with quiet satisfaction. The truth about Stallone had finally been spoken, even if it would never be officially acknowledged. Sometimes, she told her brother Tommy, the telling was more important than the believing. Carson retired in 1992, leaving behind a legacy complicated by one night when moral certainty collided with moral compromise. In his final journal entry about the Stallone confrontation, written 15 years after it happened, he concluded with a truth that had taken him decades to understand. The most dangerous moment in any man's life comes when he believes his own righteousness gives him permission to destroy another human being. That night, Stallone and I both discovered that some victories cost more than defeats. The burned telegram fragment still sits in Carson's desk drawer, a reminder that in Hollywood, everyone is both predator and prey. Everyone has something to hide, and the most trusted man in America is still just a man with secrets of his own. Some handshakes, Carson learned too late, are about more than greeting. Sometimes, they're about acknowledging that you've both reached the bottom of a very deep hole, and the only way out is to help each other climb.